Hey there! Tonight we're going to explore 50 fascinating facts about ancient civilizations and discover how their innovations, ideas, and decisions still shape our daily lives. These aren't just dusty historical curiosities. They're the building blocks of contemporary civilization, quietly influencing everything from how we organize cities to how we think about justice, trade, and human connection. Now, let your mind and body relax, and let's journey back through time and uncover the remarkable legacy that ancient peoples left for us. 1. The Phoenician alphabet completely transformed human communication. Around 1200 to 800 BCE, the Phoenicians took hundreds of complex symbols used in earlier writing systems and compressed them into roughly 22 simple phonetic letters. Each letter represented a sound rather than a whole word or concept, making writing dramatically easier to learn and use. This breakthrough spread across the Mediterranean through Phoenician trade networks, eventually evolving into Greek, Latin, and nearly every Western alphabet we use today. Before this innovation, literacy was limited to specialized scribes who spent years memorizing intricate symbol systems. The Phoenician approach democratized writing, allowing merchants, soldiers, and common people to record information, send messages, and preserve knowledge. Every time you type on a keyboard or write a note, you're using a direct descendant of this ancient simplification. The letters may look different now, but the fundamental principle that sounds can be represented by simple, reusable symbols remains unchanged after more than 3,000 years. 2. The Code of Hammurabi established a revolutionary legal principle that still underpins modern justice systems. Created around 1750 BCE in ancient Babylon, this code carved into stone didn't just list punishments. It created the idea that laws should be written down, publicly displayed, and known to everyone. Before Hammurabi, justice was often arbitrary, depending on a ruler's mood or a judge's personal interpretation. The code specified exact consequences for specific crimes, introducing predictability into legal proceedings. It covered everything from property disputes to assault, from trade disagreements to family matters. While some of its punishments seem harsh by today's standards, the underlying concept was groundbreaking. That written public laws create a fairer society than rule by individual whim. Modern legal systems from courtrooms in New York to Paris to Tokyo still operate on this same foundation. Laws must be codified, accessible, and consistently applied. The idea that ignorance of the law is no excuse comes directly from this ancient Babylonian innovation of making laws public knowledge. 3. Bronze Age civilizations created the world's first standardized measurement systems, fundamentally shaping how we conduct commerce today. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, merchants and officials developed centralized systems of weights and measures to facilitate trade across vast distances. Without standardization, a bushel in one city might differ dramatically from another, making fair exchange nearly impossible. These early systems established official weights, typically made of stone or metal, and kept in temples or government buildings that served as references. Merchants would calibrate their scales against these standards, ensuring that a pound of grain or an ounce of silver meant the same thing whether you were trading in Babylon or by the Nile. This seemingly simple innovation enabled reliable long-distance commerce, tax collection, and economic planning. Today's international standards, kilograms, meters, liters, are sophisticated descendants of this ancient need. Every time you buy produce by the pound or fuel by the gallon, you're participating in a system of standardized measurement that Bronze Age bureaucrats pioneered thousands of years ago to make their expanding economies function smoothly. 4. The urban planning of the Indus Valley civilization was astonishingly sophisticated and still influences how we design cities. Between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa featured carefully planned street grids laid out at right angles, with major boulevards and smaller side streets creating organized blocks. Even more impressive, these cities incorporated advanced drainage systems built from baked brick, with covered sewers running along streets and individual homes connected to the network. Houses had private bathrooms and waste systems that emptied into these municipal drains, showing a remarkable concern for public health and sanitation. The streets were designed with slight slopes to facilitate drainage and waste removal. This wasn't haphazard growth, it was deliberate civil engineering. Modern city planners still use these same basic principles: grid layouts for efficient navigation, centralized sanitation systems for public health, and drainage infrastructure to manage wastewater. The rectangular city block, the underground sewer, the concept of zoning residential areas, all of these trace back to innovations that Indus Valley engineers implemented over 4,000 years ago. 5. Ancient hydraulic engineering created water management principles that modern civilization still depends on. Independently, engineers in ancient China and around the Mediterranean developed sophisticated systems of dams, canals, and reservoirs to control water for agriculture, drinking, and industry. The Chinese built massive irrigation networks along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, while Roman engineers constructed aqueducts that carried water across hundreds of miles. These weren't simple ditches. They involved calculating gradients, managing water pressure, building overflow systems, and maintaining consistent flow rates. Ancient engineers understood that water management was essential for supporting large populations and productive agriculture. They developed techniques for damming rivers, redirecting flow, storing water in dry seasons, and distributing it efficiently to fields and cities. Modern irrigation systems, municipal reservoirs, and hydroelectric dams all build on these foundational concepts. The basic physics and engineering principles remain the same. Control the source, manage the flow, distribute efficiently, and maintain infrastructure. Every time you turn on a tap or see irrigated farmland, you're benefiting from hydraulic engineering concepts that ancient civilizations pioneered out of necessity. 6. The design logic of ancient amphitheaters and auditoria, prioritizing good sightlines and acoustics, came from Greek and Roman architects and still shapes modern stadium and concert hall design. Greek theaters were carved into hillsides with semicircular seating that ensured every spectator could see the performance area. The geometry wasn't accidental. It was calculated to provide clear views from every seat. Roman architects refined these designs, adding sophisticated acoustic features, vaulted ceilings, sound-reflecting surfaces, carefully shaped bowls that amplified and directed sound without distortion. Some ancient theaters had such remarkable acoustics that a coin dropped on stage could be heard in the highest seats. Modern architects study these ancient structures because the principles remain valid: sight lines determined by geometry, acoustic enhancement through shape and materials, audience capacity balanced with intimacy. When contemporary architects design concert halls, sports stadiums, or lecture theaters, they apply principles that ancient builders discovered through experimentation and mathematical understanding. The Hollywood Bowl, Sydney Opera House, and countless modern performance venues owe intellectual debts to Greek and Roman architects who first systematically solved the problem of allowing thousands to see and hear performances clearly. Those ancient builders, calculating angles and testing acoustic properties, established architectural principles that physics hasn't changed. Sound and sight still travel in predictable ways that good design can optimize. 7. The invention of coinage in ancient Lydia around the 7th century BCE revolutionized economics and created the foundation for modern monetary systems. Before coins, trade relied on bartering goods or using unstandardized lumps of precious metal that had to be weighed and assessed for purity in each transaction. Lydian kings introduced stamped coins made from electrum, a natural gold-silver alloy, with official seals guaranteeing their weight and purity. This standardization meant that a coin could circulate as a trusted token of value without constant verification. Merchants could conduct transactions quickly, governments could pay soldiers reliably, and long-distance trade became vastly more efficient. The concept spread rapidly. Within centuries, Greek city-states, Persian empires, and eventually civilizations worldwide adopted coinage. Modern currency, whether metal coins or paper bills, backed by government authority, operates on the same principle. A standardized, trusted token that represents value and facilitates exchange. Even digital currencies and electronic banking rest on this ancient Lydian insight that an agreed-upon, standardized medium of exchange, backed by trusted authority, makes complex economies possible. Every purchase you make continues a tradition that began with those first stamped pieces of metal. 8. Ancient shipbuilding innovations created maritime design principles that still inform modern vessels. Phoenician, Greek, and Chinese shipwrights independently developed sophisticated hull designs, keel structures, and sail configurations that enabled long-distance sea travel and trade. The Phoenicians mastered the rounded hull and strong keel that provided stability in rough seas. Greek triremes introduced multiple tiers of oars for speed and maneuverability. Chinese junks developed flat bottoms and watertight compartments for river and ocean navigation. These weren't arbitrary designs. They represented generations of trial, error, and refinement based on hydrodynamics, materials, science, and practical seamanship. Ancient shipbuilders understood how hull shape affected speed and stability, how keel depth prevented capsizing, and how sail configuration captured wind efficiently. Modern small ships, sailing vessels, and even some commercial boats still use hull shapes and keel concepts, pioneered in antiquity. The fundamental physics of keeping a vessel stable, moving efficiently through water, and carrying cargo safely haven't changed. What ancient maritime engineers learned through centuries of experience along Mediterranean coasts and Chinese rivers remains relevant today in yacht design, fishing vessels, and recreational boats. 9. Egyptian agricultural administration pioneered record-keeping and tax collection systems that prefigure all modern public finance. Ancient Egypt's prosperity depended on the annual Nile flood, and pharaohs developed sophisticated bureaucracies to track grain harvests, store surpluses, and collect taxes. Scribes recorded every measure of grain entering royal storehouses, calculated tax obligations based on land holdings, and maintained multi-year accounts. This wasn't casual bookkeeping. It was systematic state accounting that allowed Egypt to weather bad harvest years by drawing on reserves. The concept that governments should systematically record revenues, maintain storage facilities for public goods, and collect taxes based on documented assessments became foundational to organized states everywhere. Modern tax systems, government budgeting, and public accounting all descend from these Egyptian innovations. The idea that a state needs accurate financial records, that citizens owe taxes based on measurable criteria, and that government should maintain emergency reserves, these concepts were already sophisticated practice along the Nile thousands of years ago. Every tax form and government budget continues traditions that ancient Egyptian scribes established when they first put reed pen to papyrus. 10. Ancient Near Eastern merchants developed early forms of credit and contracts that became the ancestors of modern banking. In Mesopotamian cities, merchants couldn't always carry heavy goods or precious metals for every transaction, especially over long distances. They created letters of credit, documents that promised payment at a later date or in a different location. These proto-contracts specified terms, amounts, interest rates, collateral, and consequences for non-payment. Temple institutions sometimes served as banks, holding deposits and making loans. The fundamental concept was trust backed by documentation and social enforcement. A merchant in Babylon could issue credit to a trader in Assyria, confident that written agreements and commercial reputation would ensure payment. Modern banking, with checking accounts, lines of credit, promissory notes, and commercial loans, builds directly on these ancient innovations. The bill of exchange, the promissory note, the concept of creditworthiness all have roots in Mesopotamian commercial practice. Every time you use a credit card or take out a loan, you're participating in a system of documented, enforceable financial obligation that ancient merchants pioneered when they realized that trade could expand beyond immediate barter through trusted promises of future payment. 11. Ancient civilizations created the practice of civic memory through public inscriptions and monumental commemorations. Across the ancient world, from Egyptian temples to Roman forums to Chinese imperial monuments, societies carved important events, rulers' achievements, and significant anniversaries into stone for public display. These weren't private records. They were deliberate attempts to shape collective memory and create shared historical identity. Temple walls bore accounts of military victories, building projects listed the names of sponsors, and monuments marked significant dates. This practice established the idea that communities should publicly commemorate their past, that shared memory strengthens social bonds, and that physical monuments serve as touchstones for collective identity. Modern nations continue this exact tradition through war memorials, national monuments, historical markers, and commemorative holidays. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Independence Day, celebrations, historical preservation sites, all are descendants of this ancient impulse to publicly mark and remember significant events. The idea that societies need physical and ceremonial reminders of their past, that memory should be shared and visible, comes directly from ancient practices of carving history into stone and gathering annually to remember together. 12. Ancient trade networks for obsidian and metal demonstrate how resource supply chains have always shaped politics and economics. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, and metals like copper and tin for bronze came from specific geological locations, creating trade routes that connected distant societies. Archaeological analysis can trace obsidian artifacts back to their source volcanoes, revealing exchange networks stretching hundreds of miles. These weren't casual trades. They were systematic supply chains requiring relationships, middlemen, and political agreements to maintain. Societies without local metal sources depended on trade for essential tools and weapons, giving resource-rich regions tremendous economic and political leverage. This ancient reality foreshadowed modern globalization's fundamental lesson. Those who control critical resources, whether ancient tin deposits or modern petroleum reserves, wield disproportionate power. Trade routes became strategic assets, resource scarcity drove conflicts, and economic interdependence created both cooperation and vulnerability. Every modern discussion about supply chain security, resource geopolitics, or economic dependency echoes dynamics that ancient peoples navigated when they needed bronze for tools and weapons but lacked local copper or tin deposits. Geography and geology constrained and enabled civilizations then, just as they do now. 13. The concept of the sacred king, a ruler who combined religious and administrative authority, embedded belief systems deeply into governance structures throughout history. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and many other early states, kings weren't merely political leaders. They were intermediaries between gods and people, performers of essential rituals, and sources of cosmic order. This fusion meant that challenging political authority meant challenging religious truth, while religious legitimacy reinforced political power. The pharaoh maintained cosmic balance through ritual. The Mesopotamian king was chosen by gods to bring order, and Chinese emperors held the mandate of heaven. This intertwining of spiritual and political authority shaped how legitimacy was understood and how power was maintained across centuries. Even after formal separation of church and state in many modern nations, echoes remain. Leaders invoke divine blessing. National rituals blend civic and religious elements, and political legitimacy often draws on deeper narratives about moral order and cosmic rightness. The ancient fusion of belief and governance created patterns of authority, legitimacy, and social organization that influenced medieval kingdoms, inspired divine right monarchies, and continue to shape how societies understand the relationship between spiritual values and political power. 14. Bronze Age metallurgists developed alloying techniques that established the principle of engineered materials, transforming human capability. The discovery that combining copper and tin created bronze, a material harder and more durable than either component alone, was a revolutionary insight. This wasn't accidental. It required experimentation, temperature control, and understanding of material properties. Metallurgists learned to adjust tin ratios to create bronze suited for different purposes: harder alloys for weapons, more flexible ones for tools, specific compositions for casting. This represents humanity's first systematic engineering of materials at a chemical level, deliberately creating substances with properties not found in nature. The concept that combining elements in controlled ways produces superior materials became foundational to all subsequent technological development. Modern alloy steel, composite materials, synthetic polymers, and advanced ceramics all build on this ancient insight. Every smartphone, airplane, and building relies on engineered materials descended conceptually from that Bronze Age breakthrough. Those ancient smiths, adjusting their copper-tin ratios over hot furnaces, established a technological approach that humans can create materials with designed properties that has driven innovation ever since. 15. Early census-taking in empires like Qin and Han China and ancient Persia created the data infrastructure that governments still depend on for policy and resource allocation. These ancient censuses counted populations, recorded land holdings, documented livestock, and tracked economic production. They weren't merely interesting statistics, they were essential administrative tools. Knowing population allowed governments to calculate tax revenues, conscript armies, allocate grain reserves, and plan infrastructure. Chinese census takers recorded household composition, ages, and occupations, creating databases that enabled centralized administration of vast territories. Persian officials documented tribute obligations and military levies. The principle that effective governance requires accurate population data became foundational to state capacity. Modern governments conduct censuses for the same reasons ancient empires did: to budget appropriately, allocate representatives, plan services, and understand demographic trends. Constitutional systems like the United States base congressional representation on census counts, while welfare states use demographic data for planning healthcare, education, and social services. The methods are more sophisticated now, but the fundamental insight that you can't govern effectively without knowing whom you're governing comes directly from ancient administrative practice. Every census form you fill out continues a tradition of population documentation that ancient Chinese and Persian bureaucrats established millennia ago. 16. The terracing techniques developed by Andean farmers and Southeast Asian rice cultivators represent ancient agricultural engineering methods still used today to prevent erosion and boost yields on sloped land. Building level platforms on hillsides allows farming on terrain otherwise unsuitable for agriculture. Terraces prevent soil erosion by breaking rainfall's downward momentum and capture water for irrigation. Andean peoples constructed elaborate terrace systems in the mountains, while Southeast Asian farmers built intricate rice paddies on hillsides. These required sophisticated engineering, calculating slopes for drainage, building sturdy retaining walls, managing water flow between levels. The work was labor-intensive but created productive farmland where none existed naturally. Modern farmers in mountainous regions worldwide still use terracing for the same reasons ancient engineers developed it. The principles haven't changed. Level platforms enable cultivation. Retaining walls hold soil. Controlled water flow prevents erosion. In an era concerned with sustainable agriculture and soil conservation, these ancient techniques remain relevant. Contemporary soil conservation services recommend terracing for sloped land, using principles Andean and Asian farmers pioneered centuries ago. Those ancient agricultural engineers, laboriously building stone walls and leveling platforms on mountainsides, were solving problems of mountain agriculture that still require the same solutions. Geography creates agricultural challenges, and terracing remains an effective answer to farming steep terrain while preserving soil. 17. Mesoamerican cultures like the Olmec developed extensive trade networks for jade and obsidian that reveal sophisticated pre-Columbian globalization beyond isolated villages. These weren't simple barter exchanges between neighbors. They were long-distance networks connecting highlands and lowlands, coastal and interior regions, across hundreds of miles. Jade, prized for ritual objects and status markers, came from specific quarry sites in Guatemala and southern Mexico. Obsidian sources in the Mexican highlands supplied cutting tools throughout Mesoamerica. Archaeological finds of these materials far from their sources prove systematic trade, requiring established routes, specialized traders, and presumably security arrangements and social protocols for exchange. This challenges outdated assumptions about pre-Columbian societies as isolated or primitive. These civilizations created interconnected economic systems that moved valuable commodities across diverse terrain and political boundaries. They understood comparative advantage, that specialization and exchange benefited all participants, and organized their societies to facilitate it. Modern economic principles of trade, specialization, and network effects were already operating in ancient Mesoamerica. The Maya, Aztec, and other civilizations inherited and expanded these trade networks, creating economic integration that resembled early forms of globalization, complete with specialized merchant classes and long-distance supply chains. 18. The Persian Royal Road and its relay station system created an early version of a state postal network that enabled rapid communication across a vast empire. Stretching over 1,600 miles from Sardis to Susa, the Royal Road featured stations approximately every 15 miles, where official messengers could change horses, rest, and pass messages forward. According to Herodotus, royal couriers could cover the entire distance in about a week, remarkable speed for ancient times, because the relay system allowed continuous travel day and night. This wasn't just impressive logistics, it was essential infrastructure for centralized imperial administration. The Persian king could issue commands, receive reports from distant provinces, and coordinate military movements far more effectively than rival states. The concept that efficient communication requires infrastructure, relay systems, and official protocols became foundational to governance. Modern postal services, courier systems, and even digital communication networks descend conceptually from this ancient innovation. The Pony Express in 19th century America used the same relay principle. Today's internet routing protocols and distributed networks are high-tech versions of the same insight. That long-distance communication requires staged, reliable infrastructure with redundancy and standardized procedures. Those Persian postal riders established principles that still govern how we move information. 19. Persian Qanat systems, underground water channels, provided reliable irrigation across arid lands using gravity-fed principles that modern sustainable irrigation still employs. A qanat is a carefully engineered underground tunnel that taps into aquifers in mountainous areas and carries water downhill through gravity to agricultural fields and settlements. The tunnels prevent evaporation in hot climates while providing consistent water flow. Constructing them required remarkable surveying skill. Engineers had to calculate precise gradients over miles to maintain steady flow without stagnation or excessive speed that would cause erosion. Vertical shafts at regular intervals allowed maintenance and construction access. These systems, some of which have operated continuously for over 2,000 years, represent sustainable water management at its finest. Modern engineers study qanats for insights into low-energy, climate-appropriate irrigation. The principle, use gravity and groundwater intelligently, minimize evaporation, design for long-term sustainability, remains valid. In an era concerned with water scarcity and energy-efficient infrastructure, these ancient Persian innovations offer lessons in working with natural systems rather than against them. Every modern discussion of sustainable agriculture and water conservation echoes wisdom that ancient engineers built into underground channels beneath Iranian deserts. 20. Bronze Age evidence of managed forestry for shipbuilding shows that ancient societies were already shaping entire landscapes for industrial-scale resource supply. Shipbuilding required enormous quantities of specific types of timber, tall, straight trees for masts, strong, curved wood for hulls, durable planking for decks. Environmental archaeology reveals that ancient Mediterranean civilizations didn't just harvest wild forests randomly, they managed woodlands, cultivated tree species, and planned long-term timber supplies. Ship timbers found in archaeological sites show consistent sizes and species, suggesting controlled supply chains. This represents early recognition that industrial needs require systematic resource management, not just extraction. Ancient peoples understood that shipbuilding capacity, essential for trade, fishing, and naval power, depended on forestry planning that might take decades to mature. Modern industrial forestry, with planned rotations, species selection, and long-term yield management, descends from these ancient practices. The concept that industrial economies need to manage, not merely exploit, natural resources was already understood when Bronze Age societies began deliberately shaping forests to meet shipbuilding demands. Today's debates about sustainable forestry and renewable resources continue a conversation that ancient shipbuilders and foresters began when they realized that maritime power depended on thoughtful, multi-generational woodland management. 21. Stone toolmakers developed pressure flaking techniques that increased predictability and efficiency in production, foreshadowing modern manufacturing standardization. Pressure flaking involves carefully pressing a pointed tool against stone edges to remove precise, thin flakes, creating sharp, uniform cutting edges. This technique, refined over millennia, allowed craftspeople to produce tools with consistent shapes and reliable performance, essentially the first standardized products. Master knappers could create dozens of similar blades from prepared cores, each meeting specific criteria for sharpness, size, and durability. This wasn't crude hammering. It was controlled, skillful production that transformed raw material into consistent, functional tools. The underlying principle, that standardizing production methods yields reliable, interchangeable products, became foundational to all manufacturing. Modern assembly lines, quality control, and mass production descend conceptually from this ancient insight. Whether producing stone blades or smartphone components, the goal remains the same: develop techniques that yield consistent, predictable results. Those Stone Age craftspeople, carefully pressing antler tips against obsidian to remove perfect flakes, were practicing an approach to production, standardization through technique refinement, that would eventually revolutionize human material culture. Every manufactured object around you continues a tradition of production standardization that began with ancient toolmakers. 22. ancient glassmaking in the Near East, and Egypt introduced techniques that eventually enabled everything from windows to optical instruments. The discovery that heating silica sand with certain additives creates glass was transformative. Early glassmakers developed furnaces hot enough to melt materials, techniques for fusing and shaping molten glass, and later, the revolutionary glass-blowing method that allowed hollow vessels. These weren't simple crafts. They required understanding of materials, temperature control, and specialized skills passed through apprenticeships. Ancient glass appeared in jewelry, vessels, and decorative objects, but the techniques laid groundwork for far more. Medieval glassmakers created windows that transformed architecture by admitting light while excluding weather. Later, optical glass enabled telescopes, microscopes, and eventually the lenses in cameras and smartphones. Modern fiber optics, laboratory equipment, and countless technologies depend on glass and its properties. The material science insights of ancient Near Eastern glassmakers that controlled heating transformed certain materials into transparent, moldable substances with unique properties, opened technological pathways that continue expanding today. Every window you look through, every lens that focuses light, every glass screen you touch descends from innovations made in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian workshops where craftspeople first mastered the mysteries of molten glass. 23. The practice of apprenticeship, artisans training novices in workshops, appears across ancient craft traditions and directly preceded guilds, vocational schools, and modern apprenticeship programs. Skilled crafts, metalworking, pottery, textile production, stonework required years of training. Young people entered workshops as apprentices, learning through observation, practice, and guidance from master craftspeople. This created structured knowledge transmission outside formal schooling. Apprentices provided labor while learning, eventually becoming journeymen and potentially masters themselves. The system ensured craft knowledge passed between generations and maintained quality standards. Medieval guilds formalized apprenticeship with contracts, standards, and examinations, but built on ancient practices. Modern vocational training, trade schools, and professional apprenticeships in fields like carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work continue this tradition. The concept that practical skills require hands-on training under experienced practitioners, that learning occurs through doing rather than just studying, and that crafts maintain quality through structured knowledge transmission all come from ancient workshop practice. Those ancient potters, metalworkers, and weavers training young apprentices in their shops were establishing an educational model that has proven remarkably durable. Some skills can't be learned from books. They require demonstration, practice, correction, and time. Ancient apprenticeship recognized this reality and created a training system that has persisted because it works for transmitting practical expertise. 24. The concept of the marketplace as an institutional space, agoras in Greece, forums in Rome, created physical and social architectures for commerce and civic debate that persist today. These weren't merely open areas where people happened to gather. They were deliberately designed, regulated public spaces with specific functions. Markets had rules about weights and measures, quality standards, and dispute resolution. They served dual purposes: economic exchange and civic gathering for political discussion, announcements, and community decision-making. The marketplace became where commercial and political life intersected, where strangers could trade under established rules, and where citizens encountered diverse goods and ideas. Modern town squares, public markets, and commercial districts descend from these ancient institutional spaces. Even contemporary regulations, health codes for food vendors, permits for market stalls, consumer protection laws, echo rules established in ancient agoras. The concept that communities need designated public spaces for exchange, that markets require regulation for fair dealing, and that commercial and civic life naturally intertwine, all come from ancient urban design. Every farmer's market, every downtown square, every regulated commercial district continues spatial and institutional traditions established when Greek city-states first formalized the agora as both marketplace and civic center, recognizing that economic and political life require intentional, governed public spaces. 25. Minoan and Mycenaean maritime networks demonstrate how island-based economies specialized in shipping and exchange, creating early maritime logistics hubs. The Bronze Age Aegean civilizations, particularly Minoans on Crete, developed economies centered on seafaring rather than land-based agriculture and production. They built fleets of ships, established ports with warehousing facilities, and created networks connecting disparate regions. Minoans didn't produce everything themselves. They became middlemen, moving goods between producers and consumers across the eastern Mediterranean. This specialization in logistics and trade, rather than primary production, represented sophisticated economic thinking. They understood comparative advantage and created value through connection and distribution. Modern maritime logistics hubs, Singapore, Rotterdam, Dubai, follow the same model. Strategic locations that become wealthy, not by producing goods, but by efficiently moving them between producers and markets. The Minoan economy, based on ships, ports, warehousing, and trade relationships, pioneered the maritime logistics model that global shipping still employs. Those ancient Cretan sailors established an economic approach that geographic position and maritime infrastructure can create prosperity through facilitating others' trade that remains fundamental to how global commerce operates today. Strategic waterways and efficient ports were valuable then, just as they are now. 26. The herbal gardens of classical Greco-Roman villas and medieval monastic institutions preserved plant knowledge and genetic diversity that centuries later fed botanical science and modern horticulture. Wealthy Romans maintained villa gardens with medicinal and culinary plants from across their empire. Monasteries throughout medieval Europe cultivated herb gardens with hundreds of plant species, maintaining knowledge of their uses and cultivation requirements. These gardens weren't merely decorative, they were libraries of botanical information, preserving plants that might otherwise have vanished from cultivation and maintaining knowledge about their properties. Monks copied ancient texts about plant medicine and added their own observations from gardening experience. When European botanical science developed during the Renaissance, these garden collections and preserved texts provided essential foundation. Modern botanical gardens, seed banks, and herbal medicine practices descend from this tradition of cultivating and documenting plant knowledge. The concept that plant diversity deserves intentional preservation, that botanical knowledge requires institutional support, and that gardens serve research and conservation purposes all have roots in ancient and medieval practice. Those Roman villa owners and medieval monks, carefully tending their herb gardens and documenting plant properties, were preserving botanical knowledge and genetic material that would eventually contribute to modern pharmacology, horticulture, and conservation biology. Gardens have always been more than beauty. They're repositories of living knowledge requiring active curation. 27. The professionalization of scribes in ancient civilizations created the social role of specialized information workers that persists in modern bureaucracies and professions. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, becoming a scribe required years of training in complex writing systems. Scribes formed professional classes with distinct social status, specialized knowledge, and essential economic functions. They weren't merely literate, they were experts in administrative practice, legal formulas, religious texts, and technical documentation. This specialization created a model that complex societies need professional information workers who manage, preserve, and transmit knowledge. Scribes staffed bureaucracies, maintained archives, drafted legal documents, and educated the next generation. Their professional identity, defined by specialized knowledge and literacy, prefigured modern information professions: lawyers, accountants, administrators, archivists, journalists, and academics. The concept that information management is specialized work requiring training and credentials, that literacy is professional capital, and that societies need a class of educated information workers all stem from ancient scribal traditions. Every modern professional whose work centers on managing information, documentation, and specialized knowledge continues a tradition that began when ancient civilizations first realized that writing systems were too complex for casual literacy and required dedicated, trained specialists to function effectively. The modern knowledge worker descends from the ancient scribe. 28. Early iron smelting in the Indian subcontinent during the first millennium BCE led to agricultural tools that increased yields and enabled population growth, demonstrating how metallurgy directly enabled social complexity. Iron tools, plows, axes, sickles were harder and held edges better than bronze implements, allowing more efficient land clearing, deeper plowing, and better harvests. This wasn't a marginal improvement, it was transformative. More productive agriculture supported larger populations, which enabled more specialization, urbanization, and social stratification. The connection between metallurgical innovation and social development was direct. Better tools meant more food meant more people and more complex societies. This pattern, that material technology shapes social possibility, has repeated throughout history. The Iron Age wasn't just about different metal. It was about how that metal enabled different social structures. Modern industrial societies still follow this logic. Technological capabilities shape what societies can do and how they organize. The Green Revolution's agricultural improvements in the 20th century enabled population growth just as iron tools did millennia earlier. Those ancient Indian iron workers, perfecting smelting techniques and forging better plowshares, were enabling demographic and social transformations that would reshape the subcontinent. Every technological revolution since has followed the same pattern. Material capabilities enable social possibilities. 29. Ancient cities developed gates, walls, and controlled entrances that established ideas about zoning, defense, and municipal access control still reflected in modern urban planning. City walls weren't just military defense, they defined urban boundaries, controlled who entered and exited, facilitated tax collection on goods, and created distinct zones: inside versus outside, sacred versus profane, urban versus rural. Gates were monitored entry points where officials could inspect merchandise, check travelers, collect tolls, and maintain security. This physical infrastructure embodied concepts about territorial control, security management, and regulated access. Modern urban planning continues these principles through zoning laws that define land use, security checkpoints at sensitive facilities, controlled access neighborhoods, and border crossings. The idea that urban spaces require managed boundaries, that entry and exit should be monitored, and that different zones within cities should have different rules and purposes all descend from ancient urban design. When modern cities establish gated communities, security perimeters, or customs checkpoints, they're applying principles that Bronze and Iron Age cities pioneered when they first built walls and posted guards at gates. The fundamental insight that organized urban life requires boundaries, monitoring, and access control remains as relevant today as it was when ancient city-states first enclosed themselves within walls. 30. Ancient theater, from Greek tragedy to Roman spectacle, formalized public performance and dramatic structure in ways that contemporary storytelling still employs. Greek theater developed specific dramatic forms. Tragedy, with its arc of hubris and downfall, Comedy with its social satire, the three-act structure, the use of chorus, and character archetypes. These weren't arbitrary choices. They represented refined understanding of how stories engage audiences emotionally and intellectually. Roman theater added spectacle and refined staging. Together, ancient performance, traditions established conventions, beginning, middle, and end, rising action and climax, character development and conflict, themes explored through action. Modern screenwriting, television drama, and stage performance all use structures and techniques developed in ancient amphitheaters. The hero's journey, tragic flaw, comic relief, dramatic irony, these storytelling tools were formalized by ancient playwrights who experimented with what moved audiences. Contemporary film directors, TV showrunners, and novelists inherit this tradition. Every time you watch a movie with a three-act structure or see a character's fatal flaw lead to downfall, you're experiencing narrative conventions that Sophocles, Euripides, and their contemporaries developed in 5th century BCE Athens. Ancient theater didn't just entertain, it created the grammar of dramatic storytelling that we still use to make sense of narratives. 31. Ancient cities developed organized firefighting and watch systems that represent early risk management and communal safety structures, precursors to modern emergency services. Urban fires were catastrophic threats in ancient cities built primarily of wood and thatch. Archaeological and historical evidence from Bronze and Iron Age settlements shows organized responses. Night watchmen patrolling streets, designated water supplies maintained for emergencies, and community responsibility systems where residents responded collectively to fires. In some cities, regulations required householders to keep water vessels ready and participate in bucket brigades. This wasn't haphazard. It was institutionalized safety management, recognizing that urban density created shared risks requiring collective solutions. The concept that communities need organized emergency response, that fire prevention is a public responsibility, and that cities should invest in safety infrastructure all derive from these ancient practices. Modern fire departments with professional firefighters building codes that mandate fire safety and emergency response systems represent sophisticated developments of the same underlying principle. That urban life requires institutionalized protection against disaster. Those ancient night watchmen, carrying torches through dark streets and sounding alarms at the first sign of smoke, were the earliest version of a service that every modern city still requires, organized communal protection against urban hazards. 32. Salt mining and salt route economies shaped settlement patterns, trade relationships, and taxation systems from antiquity through the modern era, demonstrating how basic commodities drive political economy. Salt was essential for preserving food before refrigeration, making it literally vital for survival. Societies with salt sources, coastal areas with sea salt evaporation, or inland regions with salt deposits gained economic and political leverage. Trade routes developed around salt transport, cities grew at salt route intersections, and governments monopolized salt production to generate revenue. The phrase, "not worth his salt," referring to Roman soldiers paid partially in salt, salary from sal, salt, reflects its economic importance. States from ancient China to colonial India used salt taxes as major revenue sources, sometimes sparking rebellions when taxes became excessive. The pattern was consistent across cultures and millennia. Control of essential commodities enables political power and generates state revenue. Modern governments still tax essential goods, fuel, tobacco, alcohol, following the same logic ancient states applied to salt. The lesson remains: whoever controls what everyone needs wields disproportionate power. Those ancient salt mining operations and the trade routes they spawned demonstrate that commodity economics have always been fundamentally political, a reality that continues today with petroleum, rare earth elements, and other strategic resources. 33. Mayan astronomers achieved remarkable precision in tracking celestial movements without any modern instruments. Through centuries of patient observation, they created calendars and eclipse prediction tables that rival modern calculations in accuracy. The Maya tracked Venus's movements across the sky with such precision that their calendar for Venus differs from modern calculations by only hours over thousands of years. They predicted solar and lunar eclipses, marked equinoxes and solstices, and understood astronomical cycles that guided agricultural planting and religious ceremonies. Their observatories were carefully positioned buildings with sight lines aligned to track specific celestial events. These weren't primitive guesses, they were systematic, multi-generational scientific projects that accumulated data and refined predictions over centuries. The Maya proved that reliable timekeeping and astronomical prediction were possible long before telescopes, computers, or even advanced mathematics. Modern astronomy acknowledges that these ancient observers, using nothing but naked eye observation, careful record-keeping, and mathematical insight, understood the heavens in ways that allowed them to create functional, accurate calendars that governed entire civilizations. The scientific method, observe, record, predict, verify, was alive and well in ancient Mesoamerica. 34. The massive logistics of early monumental building projects, pyramids, ziggurats, great walls, required centralized project management and supply chain coordination that established principles of large-scale construction administration. Building something like the Great Pyramid involved quarrying millions of stone blocks, transporting them over distances, feeding and housing thousands of workers, coordinating specialized labor teams, maintaining tool supplies, and scheduling work phases across decades. This required unprecedented organizational capacity, recording systems for tracking materials and labor, hierarchical management structures, supply logistics, and long-term planning. These weren't chaotic crowd efforts. They were systematically managed projects with foremen, specialized work gangs, administrative records, and resource allocation systems. Modern construction project management, with its schedules, supply chains, subcontractor coordination, and hierarchical organization, descends from techniques ancient engineers developed. The critical path method, resource leveling, and staged construction scheduling are sophisticated versions of problems ancient project managers solved when they coordinated feeding workers, delivering stone, and scheduling teams. Those ancient Egyptian construction administrators, calculating worker days and coordinating stone delivery schedules, were pioneering project management principles that every modern construction manager, whether building skyscrapers or highways, still uses. Large-scale construction has always required similar organizational sophistication, regardless of technological level. 35. Ancient urban marketplaces for medical drugs and herbal remedies became nodes of empirical medical knowledge transfer, prefiguring modern pharmacies as both commercial and knowledge institutions. In cities like Alexandria, ancient Indian markets, and Chinese urban centers, specialized vendors sold medicinal plants, mineral compounds, and prepared remedies. These weren't merely merchants, they were often practitioners with specialized knowledge about preparations, dosages, and applications. Markets became places where medical knowledge accumulated and spread, where physicians learned about new remedies, and where empirical observations about what worked were shared and refined. Successful remedies gained reputations and spread through trade networks, while ineffective ones faded from use. This created a form of distributed medical research, thousands of practitioners experimenting, observing, and sharing results through commercial channels. Modern pharmacies inherit both functions, dispensing substances and providing expert knowledge about their use. The concept that medication providers should be trained specialists, that pharmaceutical knowledge requires systematic documentation, and that drug distribution should involve expert guidance, all have roots in these ancient medical marketplaces. Every pharmacy with a trained pharmacist who advises on medications continues a tradition begun when ancient healers first established market stalls where they sold remedies and shared the accumulated wisdom of medical practice. Commerce and knowledge transfer were intertwined then as they remain in healthcare today. 36. Ancient Iberian, Celtic, and Germanic metalworkers developed localized alloy recipes and decorative motifs that influenced medieval jewelry traditions and modern craft revivals. These Iron Age cultures created distinctive metalwork styles: Celtic torques with intricate knotwork, Germanic fibulae with animal designs, Iberian jewelry with unique patterns. The metalworkers mastered bronze, iron, and precious metal crafting, developing local aesthetic traditions and technical expertise. These weren't primitive crafts, they were sophisticated artistic traditions with apprenticeship systems and recognized masters. When these cultures encountered Roman civilization, their metalworking traditions influenced Roman provincial styles and survived Roman conquest. Medieval European metalwork inherited techniques and motifs from these traditions. Contemporary Celtic jewelry, Viking-inspired designs, and craft revivals that reference ancient patterns all draw on these ancient artistic traditions. The persistence of these design motifs across centuries demonstrates that artistic traditions have deep roots and that craft knowledge transmitted through generations maintains cultural identity. Those ancient Celtic, Germanic, and Iberian smiths, creating intricate metalwork with distinctive regional styles, were establishing artistic traditions that would influence European decorative arts for centuries. Their technical mastery and aesthetic choices became part of European cultural heritage, periodically rediscovered and celebrated by later generations seeking connection to ancient artistic achievements. Traditional motifs remain recognizable and valued millennia after their creation. 37. Roman and Hellenistic engineers used water wheels and simple hydraulic machines that evolved into medieval mills and eventually powered industrial machinery, demonstrating how mechanical innovation builds incrementally. Water wheels harnessed flowing water to perform work, grinding grain, pumping water, sawing stone. This represented a crucial breakthrough, using natural force through mechanical advantage to replace human or animal labor. The technology wasn't complex by modern standards, but the principle was revolutionary. Ancient engineers understood gears, axles, and power transmission. They designed mechanisms where water turning a wheel could drive millstones or operate bellows. Medieval Europe expanded water wheel use dramatically, powering textile mills, metalworking, and more. The Industrial Revolution's steam engines replaced water power but used the same mechanical principles, converting rotational motion into useful work through gears and transmission. Modern turbines generating electricity are sophisticated descendants of ancient water wheels. The fundamental insight that natural forces can be captured mechanically to do useful work transformed human productivity. Those Roman engineers, designing water wheels to grind grain by river force rather than human effort, were establishing mechanical principles that would eventually power the modern world. Every hydroelectric dam continues their innovation, using flowing water through turbines to generate power, just as ancient mills used flowing water through wheels to grind flour. 38. The Chinese invention of the crossbow and composite bow changed warfare and encouraged state-level armories and logistics, demonstrating how weapons technology drives organizational complexity. The crossbow was revolutionary. It could be operated effectively with less training than a traditional bow, delivered powerful shots, and could be loaded and held ready. Composite bows, made from layers of materials with different properties, offered more power than simple wooden bows. These technologies required specialized manufacture and consistent supply of components. Chinese states developed armories, workshops producing standardized weapons in quantity, and logistic systems to equip armies. The concept that military effectiveness requires industrial production of standard weapons, rather than each soldier providing their own, represented organizational evolution. Modern military-industrial complexes with standard-issue weapons produced by defense contractors and maintained through supply chains descend from these ancient Chinese innovations. The principle that advanced weapons require centralized production, that armies need logistics systems to supply equipment, and that weapons standardization increases military effectiveness, all emerged when ancient Chinese states first established armories to produce crossbows in quantity. Every modern defense department managing weapons procurement continues organizational patterns that ancient Chinese military administrators pioneered when warfare technology became too complex for individual soldiers to manufacture their own equipment. 39. Early maps from Babylon, Greece, and China fused mythological understanding with empirical observation, creating cartographic traditions that evolved into modern mapping while teaching about the politics of representation. Ancient maps weren't purely objective representations, they reflected how societies understood space, power, and cosmos. Babylonian clay tablets showed local geography with mythological edges. Chinese maps placed China at the center, reflecting political cosmology. Greek maps attempted geometric accuracy while incorporating legendary lands. These early cartographic efforts reveal that maps are never neutral. They represent particular worldviews and political perspectives. The development of more accurate, measurement-based mapping was gradual, but even modern cartography involves choices about projection, scale, what to include or omit, and how to represent political boundaries. The history of cartography teaches that representing space is always interpretive. Modern debates about map projections, which distort sizes of regions differently, about naming contested territories, or about digital mapping's corporate perspectives, continue ancient tensions between objective representation and political meaning. Those Babylonian cartographers, drawing the world as they understood it on clay tablets, were grappling with the same fundamental challenge modern mapmakers face: how to represent complex, political, multidimensional reality on a flat surface. Every map still carries the legacy of these ancient choices about what to show and how to show it. 40. Ancient stamp seals and signet rings authenticated documents and goods through indelible personal marks, establishing security and verification principles that persist in signatures and cryptographic concepts. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, individuals and institutions possessed unique seals, carved stones or cylinders, that, when pressed into clay or wax, left distinctive impressions. These authenticated contracts secured storage, containers, and verified authorship. Breaking a seal meant tampering was evident. The underlying concept was identity verification through unforgeable marks. Only the seal's owner could produce that specific impression, so a sealed document or container was guaranteed authentic. This physical security extended trust across space and time. A merchant could seal goods, and the recipient could verify they hadn't been tampered with. A king could seal an order, and recipients would know it was genuine. Modern signatures serve the same purpose, as do digital signatures and cryptographic keys in electronic communications. The principle remains constant. Unique, individual marks that are difficult to forge can authenticate identity and verify integrity. Every time you sign a document or use digital encryption, you're employing a security concept that ancient Mesopotamian merchants pioneered when they first rolled carved cylinder seals across clay to prove ownership, authenticate agreements, and secure goods against tampering. The technology evolved, but the concept of unforgeable personal authentication remained essential. 41. Greek Stoic and Epicurean philosophies shaped Western ideas of civic virtue, happiness, and self-control that still permeate modern self-help, political thought, and ethical frameworks. The Stoics taught that virtue lies in accepting what you cannot control while mastering your responses, that external circumstances don't determine well-being, internal character does. Epicureans argued that pleasure, properly understood, comes from simple living, friendship, and freedom from anxiety, rather than endless acquisition. These weren't abstract theories. They were practical philosophies for living well. They addressed questions people still ask: how do I find happiness? How should I respond to misfortune? What matters in life? Modern cognitive behavioral therapy echoes Stoic insights about controlling thoughts rather than circumstances. Self-help literature constantly rediscovers Epicurean ideas about simplicity and gratitude. Political concepts of civic duty and personally responsibility draw on Stoic virtue ethics. These ancient philosophical schools created vocabularies and frameworks for thinking about human flourishing that Western culture has never fully moved beyond. Every modern discussion of resilience, mindfulness, or the good life unknowingly references concepts that Zeno, Epictetus, Epicurus, and their followers articulated over 2 millennia ago. Those ancient philosophers, teaching in Athenian porticos, were establishing ethical frameworks that would shape how Western civilization thinks about virtue, happiness, and the examined life for centuries to come. 42. The domestication of crops like millet, einkorn wheat, and sorghum in different ancient agricultural centers created staple foods that still feed billions and structure global cuisines. These weren't inevitable choices. They were the results of millennia of selection by ancient farmers who noticed which plants had desirable traits and saved their seeds. Einkorn and emmer, wheat in the Fertile Crescent, rice in East Asia, millet in Africa and China, maize in Mesoamerica, sorghum in sub-Saharan Africa. Each region domesticated local wild plants through patient selection over countless generations. This process transformed inedible or marginally useful wild grasses into productive crops with larger seeds, easier harvesting, and reliable yields. Modern agriculture still depends almost entirely on these ancient domestications. The vast majority of calories humans consume worldwide come from plants that ancient farmers domesticated thousands of years ago. Subsequent breeding improved yields and traits, but the fundamental work, identifying useful plants and transforming them through selection into crops, was done by Neolithic farmers whose names we'll never know. Every meal you eat likely includes grains that exist in their current form because ancient peoples patiently selected seeds, season after season, gradually transforming wild plants into the agricultural foundations of civilization. Our food system rests on their accumulated botanical knowledge and patient work. 43. Ancient urban sewage and latrine technology, well preserved at sites like Mohenjo-Daro, demonstrates early concern for public hygiene that directly informs modern sanitation engineering. The Indus Valley cities had sophisticated sewage systems with covered drains along streets, private household toilets connected to the network, and even public bathing facilities. This wasn't accidental. It represented deliberate urban planning prioritizing sanitation and public health. Similarly, Roman cities built sewers, public latrines, and aqueducts to maintain hygiene. These ancient engineers understood that urban density creates health risks from accumulated waste, that waterborne sewage removal reduces disease, and that public health requires infrastructure investment. The principles they established: separate drinking water from sewage, use gravity and water, flow for waste removal, provide public sanitation facilities, design systems for easy cleaning, remain fundamental to modern sanitation engineering. When 19th century cities finally built comprehensive sewer systems during the public health revolution, they were rediscovering principles that Indus Valley and Roman engineers had implemented millennia earlier. Every modern toilet connected to municipal sewers, every urban drainage system, every public health regulation about sanitation continues traditions that ancient urban planners pioneered when they first recognized that city living requires systematic waste management to prevent disease. Those ancient engineers literally laid the groundwork for urban public health. 44. Ancient string instruments like the lyre, lute, and their relatives formed musical family trees that evolved into classical instruments and provided foundations for music theory. These early instruments, strings stretched over resonating bodies, played by plucking or with bows, established fundamental principles of musical sound production. Different string lengths produced different pitches. Tension affected tone, resonating chambers amplified sound. Ancient musicians discovered harmonic relationships, that strings at certain length ratios produced pleasing intervals. Greek thinkers like Pythagoras formalized these observations into mathematical ratios, creating early music theory. The instruments themselves evolved through refinement, better materials, more strings, improved resonance, leading eventually to lutes, guitars, violins, and pianos. But the fundamental physics and musical principles were established in antiquity. The circle of fifths, harmonic scales, consonance and dissonance, concepts that structure Western music, were first articulated by ancient musicians experimenting with string lengths and listening carefully to relationships between tones. Modern music theory, instrument construction, and even electronic music, synthesis dealing with frequencies and harmonics all build on insights that ancient lyre players and theorists discovered. Those ancient musicians, plucking strings and listening closely, were beginning the systematic exploration of sound that would eventually become the science and art of music as we know it today. 45. Standardized brick sizes in Bronze Age cities made construction modular and faster, demonstrating that modular building units are a long-standing engineering convenience with persistent advantages. In cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Mesopotamian settlements, bricks were produced in consistent sizes, typically rectangular with standard dimensions. This wasn't random. Standardization meant that builders could plan structures knowing exactly how bricks would fit, calculate material needs precisely, and work more efficiently. Different craftspeople could produce bricks that would work together in the same structure. Doorways, walls, and arches could be designed using standard modules. This modular approach reduced construction time, simplified planning, and allowed specialization. Some workers made bricks, others built with them. Modern construction uses the same logic, from standardized lumber dimensions to prefabricated components to modular building systems. The principle is timeless. Standardizing building components makes construction more efficient, predictable, and scalable. Contemporary modular construction and prefabrication are sophisticated versions of an insight ancient builders had when they first standardized brick sizes. Those Bronze Age brickmakers, carefully forming clay into consistent rectangular blocks, were establishing a construction approach that has never been improved upon in principle. Make components standard, and assembly becomes faster, cheaper, and more reliable. Every modern building code that specifies standard dimensions continues this ancient practice. 46. The evolution of siegecraft and fortification design, with innovations like battering rams and concentric walls, pushed defensive architecture toward increasing complexity, with modern military engineering still studying ancient techniques for lessons. Ancient warfare drove architectural innovation as attackers developed siege engines and defenders responded with stronger fortifications. Battering rams required gates and walls capable of withstanding repeated impacts. Siege towers prompted higher walls. Concentric fortifications with multiple defensive layers made cities progressively harder to capture. Defenders added killing fields, multiple gates, and complex entry systems that channeled attackers into vulnerable positions. This arms race between offensive and defensive technology drove centuries of innovation. Medieval castles inherited and refined ancient fortification principles. Modern military installations, though using different materials and facing different threats, still apply principles ancient engineers discovered: defense in depth, overlapping fields of fire, controlled access points, redundant barriers. Military academies study ancient sieges like Masada and Alesia for strategic lessons. Those ancient military engineers, designing walls to withstand rams and creating fortifications with multiple defensive layers, were establishing principles of defensive architecture that remain relevant. The fundamental challenge, protecting defenders while exposing attackers, hasn't changed, and ancient solutions to that challenge still inform military engineering, thinking about how to design defensible positions and fortified facilities. 47. Temple-based astronomical observatories at Babylonian ziggurats and Chinese imperial platforms recorded sky motions systematically, seeding predictive astronomy and calendrical reform that enabled agricultural and religious coordination. Ancient astronomers tracked planets, stars, and moon phases, night after night, season after season, accumulating decades and centuries of observations. Babylonian astronomers recorded celestial positions on clay tablets, eventually recognizing patterns that allowed prediction of planetary positions and eclipses. Chinese imperial astronomers similarly maintained detailed records, seeing their work as essential for proper governance and agricultural timing. These weren't casual observations, they were systematic, multi-generational scientific projects. The accumulated data revealed that celestial motions followed regular patterns, that eclipses could be predicted, that seasons cycled reliably. This predictive capacity transformed agriculture by providing reliable calendars for planting and harvesting. It also influenced religious and political timing of festivals and ceremonies. Modern astronomy builds on this tradition of patient, systematic observation and data accumulation. The scientific method: observe consistently, record carefully, identify patterns, make predictions, verify them, was alive in these ancient observatories. Those Babylonian and Chinese astronomers, spending cold nights watching the sky and meticulously recording what they saw, were establishing astronomy as a predictive science and demonstrating that nature follows regular, discoverable laws. Their work proved that the universe operates by consistent principles humans can understand through observation. 48. The domestication of horses and the subsequent invention of chariots transformed communication, warfare, and trade speeds, demonstrating how mobility technologies repeatedly reorganize societies. Before horses, humans moved at walking pace, perhaps 20 miles per day over rough terrain. Horses allowed much faster travel, but chariots, wheeled vehicles drawn by horse teams, provided speed, cargo capacity, and military advantage. Armies with chariots dominated those without. Messages could be carried much farther in a day. Trade goods could move overland more efficiently. This mobility revolution restructured political possibility. Empires could maintain control over larger territories because communication and military response became faster. Later, riding horses directly rather than using chariots further increased mobility. The pattern has repeated with every mobility technology since: railroads, automobiles, aircraft, digital communication. Each collapsed distance and time, reorganizing what was politically and economically possible. Ancient societies that mastered horse and chariot technology gained enormous advantages, just as modern nations that controlled railroad networks or aircraft production gained strategic superiority. Those ancient peoples who first harnessed horses to vehicles and learned to control them at speed were pioneering a pattern that societies must adopt new mobility technologies or be dominated by those who do. That has shaped history ever since. Transportation technology has always been strategic technology. 49. Early glass bead production connected distant peoples through ornament trade and established standardized decorative styles, showing how mass-produced personal goods have long served as network markers and cultural connectors. Glass beads were relatively easy to produce in quantity once techniques were mastered, lightweight for transport, and universally desired as ornaments. Production centers in the Mediterranean, India, and elsewhere produced standardized beads, specific colors, shapes, and sizes that were traded across vast distances. Archaeologists find the same bead types in sites thousands of miles apart, proving extensive trade networks. These weren't just pretty objects, they were social currencies, markers of connection to larger networks, and symbols of participation in far-reaching exchange systems. People wore imported beads to signal cosmopolitanism and connection. The pattern continues today with mass-produced consumer goods that spread globally, branded clothing, electronics, accessories, serving similar functions as social markers and network indicators. The human desire for portable, decorative objects that signal connection to broader worlds is ancient. Those early glass bead makers, producing standardized ornaments for trade, were creating some of humanity's first mass-produced consumer goods and demonstrating that personal decorative items would always be important trade commodities, carrying not just aesthetic but social and economic meaning across cultural boundaries. 50. Ancient codes of ritual purity and early quarantine notices represent public health practices that anticipated modern isolation during epidemics, showing ancient awareness of contagion principles. Some ancient cities posted notices about sick individuals or restricted access during outbreaks. Ritual purity codes in various cultures, while religiously motivated, often had practical health effects, requiring washing, isolating certain conditions, restricting contact with sick individuals or corpses. These practices, though lacking germ theory, recognized that disease could spread through contact or proximity. Lepers were isolated in many ancient societies. Ships suspected of carrying plague were sometimes quarantined in port. The underlying insight that separating sick from healthy can prevent disease spread was understood empirically long before microbiology explained why. Modern quarantine, isolation protocols, and infection control descend from these ancient practices. The word quarantine itself comes from Italian quaranta, meaning 40 days, the period ships were isolated during medieval plague outbreaks, continuing ancient practice. When modern public health authorities implement isolation measures during epidemics, they're using strategies that ancient peoples developed through observation and experience. Those ancient communities that isolated sick individuals or restricted movement during outbreaks were practicing early epidemiology, recognizing empirically what would later be understood scientifically, that containing contact can contain disease. The practice predated the theory by millennia. And there you have it, 50 fascinating ancient civilizations and their profound influence on contemporary life. The ancient peoples created foundational systems that persist today. These weren't primitive societies we've surpassed. They were sophisticated civilizations solving fundamental challenges of human organization, and their solutions proved so effective that we continue using them millennia later. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient innovations and their modern legacy, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history, science, and the fascinating connections between past and present. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that every time you interact with money, law, cities, or even language itself, you're participating in systems that ancient peoples pioneered. History isn't something that happened and ended, it's the foundation we're still building upon. I'll see you in the next video.